Well, Brian, welcome to today's webinar. I really appreciate the time and an opportunity to talk about some of your recent work. But to get into this, I wanted to do a few introductions because in my community, you are widely known and people know your background and your expertise. But we want this video to go much further than my small circle of friends. And I wanted people to get a feel for who we are. As for me, I'm the moderator, Bob Gorley. I'm a former Navy intelligence officer and chief technology officer, and now I'm part of the OODA network. Our website at OODALoop.com tracks issues of geopolitical risk and the future of technology and cybersecurity. And we have a network of about 300 professionals who work with us to assess those things and work together to kind of raise each other's awareness of what they need to know. And that's me. I'm the moderator today. Brian, let me give a brief introduction of what I think about you and then let you correct the record and tell people your real bio. Brian, I regard you as one of the nation's greatest experts on some of the most complex asymmetric threats we have ever faced, including international crime, international terrorism, state-on-state violence, and domestic violence and domestic terrorism. As proof of your expertise, you have an extensive publishing record, articles, books, journals, pieces at RAND Corporation, where you are currently a senior advisor to the president of RAND. That's a bit of your background, but from my perspective. But would you please, Brian, introduce yourself?
Uh, thank you, Bob, for the kind words. Actually, I'm a former soldier, going back many years. Served in special forces in Latin America and in Vietnam. And after leaving the Army, went directly from the military to the RAND Corporation, where I have spent the last, better than the last half century, looking at some of those topics that you mentioned in your introduction. I tell people, give me another 50 years, I'll have it all sorted out. But these are continuing threats, and they really merit our attention. Fortunately, the position I have now allows me a freedom to explore personally and to put together teams to explore issues that I think are important, even when these issues are extremely difficult for our government to get their hands around because of political constraints, because of polarization of the country, and so on. And that certainly takes us right into the background of this most recent report on preparing for violence in the 2024 elections.
Okay. Thank you, Brian. And this report is based upon a series of workshops you pulled together with a lot of other noted experts and individuals. I guess you had a couple workshops and then you did the hard work of rolling up your sleeves and producing this report. A key takeaway I have from it is that it's the belief of you and your team that for our democracy to really endure, we must be able to have elections that are safe from violence and the threat of violence against the candidates, the poll workers, the citizens who want to cast their vote. That it's really critical to get our hand on ways to mitigate any threats to violence in elections. That was a key takeaway I had.
No, that certainly is the key factor. I mean, that to be able to elect our own leadership is one of the fundamental tenets of a democracy. And to the extent that that is impeded by threats or acts of violence or disrupted or other things that can cause people to lose confidence in the integrity of the election itself, I think really is a major long-term threat to our country. In fact, it's probably worse than any foreign threat that we can deal with, although we live in an environment in which foreign threats and domestic threats are no longer separated by a bright shining line, and so there are active foreign information operations that are calculated to take our differences and magnify those in an effort to even further polarize and paralyze our political system.
Hey, Brian, and before we get into the meat of this report and some of your context on that, I wanted to ask, who was this report written for? Who do you target this at?
The primary audience are the governors and secretaries of state and election officials in our states and territories. Under the Constitution, they are responsible for the conduct of the elections. And they will be the first ones to have to confront the threats, and if there are any incidents, that will be a local response. The federal government, of course, has a responsibility of protecting the presidential candidates and a handful of others, but the conduct of the elections is a state matter, and therefore this was aimed squarely at the governors and the things that they could do, practical measures that they could implement without legislation, without lengthy political debate, that would help their specific jurisdictions be aware of and prepare for a potential array of threats.
Thanks, Brian. And as we get into the meat of this, I think that just underscores the point that anybody watching this video can help by helping disseminate your report. I'll put links to the report in the notes wherever we send this video, so people can download it, read it themselves, and then help get this thing read by the right executives in the states and local governments, as well as law enforcement in the state and local area.
Well, no, I appreciate that. You know, the project itself, this specific project began, if I can go back into the origins for a moment, began really last fall when discussions with officials at the Department of Homeland Security and in other government officials and other agencies of the government indicated that preparing for potential election violence was really a difficult subject to discuss in today's hyper-partisan atmosphere. Domestic intelligence, that term itself has become toxic. It's assaulted by both ends of the political spectrum. There is, as we read daily, deep suspicion of the so-called deep state. Everything today seems vulnerable to misunderstanding, or in this case, deliberate misrepresentation. In fact, to try to express this, I can only invent words that don't exist, and words like misportrayal or disunderstanding, I think may be a more accurate description. And those discussions led to this private effort to address the topic. I emphasize the word private. This was not government initiated. This was not government or institutionally funded. It had no connection with any political party. It had no political agenda. It was a completely independent and nonpartisan effort. Now, given the array of participants, I'm sure their personal preferences really covered the spectrum. However, they left their political coats at the door, and as I say, we really worked together to focus on practical measures that we thought were important to the country. So in this process, I was able to put together a diverse group of, let me just call them concerned citizens. And we got together in a series of workshops to examine this issue and to share their observations and expertise. Now, some of them were former federal officials, but the majority represented local government, local law enforcement. There were a number of legal scholars. We had some technical advice. We had former sheriffs, and including a shout out to John Sullivan, who is a member of your OODA group, regular, and to Matt DeVost, who really helped us enormously in terms of understanding some of the technical issues that we were facing. And again, to emphasize this, the audiences we saw were state and local authorities. You mentioned, I think, what is the key observation, and really that if we're going to have a democracy, people have to be able to vote without threat, vote without violence, and be assured that the counting of those ballots is not going to be tampered with, interrupted, or in some way, their selection will be obviated. Now, some of the key findings that came about, which are really sobering, we concluded that local officials, state officials, ought not to assume that intelligence efforts will provide advance warning. In part because of as I mentioned, the issue of domestic intelligence collection, always a delicate undertaking in a democracy, but has become even more contentious because of timidity, because of the nature of the threat itself. These are threats that are not necessarily to have indicators that something is being planned necessarily that will be available to the authorities, and therefore local authorities are going to be reacting to events. Our biggest concern is that in the current fraught atmosphere, a small localized incident turbocharged by the electronic and social media could spiral into a national crisis, and that's why we focused on the local level. Another sobering finding was that when we talked to our law enforcement representatives, they said that they were really, police are in a difficult position right now. They're really not adequately prepared to deal with a large-scale protest. Many of the departments across the country are shorthanded. They have in recent years, since the pandemic, and lost a lot of their senior leadership that had a great deal of experience. And so they're struggling. Now, does that mean the feds take over? And no, another conclusion really was that heavy-handed federal intervention will be not only futile, but potentially escalatory. And so these have to be handled at the local and state level. Now, given that rather dark assessment, we thought that it was still possible to create some purpose-built, ad hoc, organizational structures that would assist in preparedness. We thought that violence during the election campaigns themselves was likely to focus on the candidates and the campaign events. Although, some of this could also easily result from some of the, I think, ill-advised rhetoric by some of the political leadership leaders themselves. The two political conventions that took place without major incidents, we also thought those were potential targets, but they were designated national special security events, which which brings federal, state, and local officials together in security planning months in advance. And as I say, both of those occurred without major incident. And I think that is a lesson to be learned there, that advance planning and coordination can keep things under control. But the biggest threat, the most likely threat, we thought would come from isolated actions by individuals not necessarily tethered to any organized group. Of course, our greatest concern, and this was written before the first attempt on President Trump's life, former President Trump, we said was assassination attempts. That was the biggest concern, and those would be game changers. Now, consistent with past assassination attempts on presidents, insofar as we know now, although the investigations are continuing, these two attempts did not involve any kind of broad conspiracy or necessarily even purely political motives. They appear to have been carried out by troubled individuals, perhaps responding to a feverish political atmosphere, pursuing personal grudges, or seeking individual notoriety. Now that's consistent with most previous assassination attempts on U.S. presidents. I should point out here that being president of the United States is a dangerous occupation. Of the 22 presidents who served in office since 1900, 2 have been killed while in office. 1 was wounded. 2 more were shot at and missed, and 1 was the target of an armed assault. And in addition to that, 2 former presidents were wounded while seeking re-election after leaving office. Now, that's 8 presidents out of 22, more than a third. That exceeds the risks of U.S. infantrymen in combat since World War I. So this is a dangerous job, and that doesn't count the shots fired at the White House, planes crashing into the White House, or various thwarted terrorist plots, foreign-inspired terrorist plots against American presidents. Now, as I said, that was the focus during the campaign. But we concluded also that when the polls close on November 5th, we don't get to breathe a sigh of relief. That the dynamics of the threat will change, and that is because fearful that the election is being stolen, or that the winning political opponent will destroy the country or directly threaten the security of the losing side, extremists on both ends of the spectrum may take desperate measures. There are some others, I should point out, that regardless of who wins, see the divisive period as an opportunity to create chaos and destabilize the country and accelerate a race war or a civil war or whatever other fantasy they may have. In the post-election period, the violence is going to focus, we think, primarily on the process of counting, auditing, and certifying the election results. That will take days. Inevitably, there will be claims of fraud, demands for recounts. Litigation tensions are going to remain high, and so therefore, I think we have to anticipate potential actions against the transit of ballots, the locations where ballots are counted, and the state houses as we move towards certification at the state level and ultimately the federal level.
Yeah, and Brian, and perhaps also the court system, since so many cases will be brought in front of the courts.
You're absolutely right there. The courts themselves will become scenes of demonstrations, of protests, potential confrontations, and there again, you always have the concern that what starts as a perfectly legitimate protest escalates into a confrontation, and in turn escalates further into violence. And again, in today's media-saturated environment, that will streak across the country on the electronic and social media, and potentially inspire copycat incidents across the country, and things can get out of hand fairly quickly. The longer term danger, however, is that there's a potential trend here, and think about it. In the period between, let's say, the election night and the inauguration of a president, there are three broad potential scenarios. One is that common sense prevails, and apart from a few incidents, the elections take place essentially peacefully, and that's great. That's what everyone is hoping for. At the other end, there's a possibility that things escalate and we find ourselves not in the civil war, I think that some pundits are pointing to, but in major social political disruptions and combat across the country. That's another possibility. And if that occurs, we've got an immediate problem. But there's a kind of a messy middle where we could see more confrontations, more incidents of violence in the 2024 elections than we saw in 2020, 2021. And that continues beyond the inauguration, undermining the authority and the legitimacy of whoever is deemed the winner, and sets off a trend toward even greater violence in the 2026 and 2028 elections. And so that becomes a concern, because then it suggests that we have a long range problem, not simply an aberration that occasionally shows up, but that we are in the process of fundamentally altering how our political system works.
All right. Ryan, thanks for this overview. I have a few questions, and I want to open it up to our questions from our audience too. But one of the first I have is we're dealing with human nature here, and there's an old adage in the military. It goes something like, we're always planning to fight the last war. And maybe that's overly simplistic, but frequently you see in the military, you build weapons to win the last war, and you find it's a different situation now. And in the cybersecurity domain, we see that at play in cyber attacks. We see organizations will get a cyber attack, they will figure out what happened, they'll do forensics, they'll push the bad guy out, they'll patch their systems, and then they'll quickly forget that there was a threat. And then they get surprised again. And I wonder if you think some of that human nature is at play here with election security. It seems like this was news in 2020. There were serious incidents. Is there this attitude that people think, well, it's obviously been addressed?
No, I certainly think that is a concern. Let me respond to that in two ways. Clearly, looking back at what happened in the past, there is a tendency to see that as an aberration, not as a potential indicator of trouble trouble looking ahead. Second, there is a presumption that, well, certainly somebody has us covered. I think there's another tendency when you look at problems that seem horrific and yet really difficult to deal with. People sometimes those in positions of authority take a kind of an ostrich approach. Just we just can't deal with it. There's no net gain here for me taking on this terrible problem. Now, in the area that we're talking about, it becomes even more difficult, because in many cases we are talking about enforcing laws, law enforcement. Countries is a country of law. We don't write laws for crimes that haven't yet occurred. So if we see something entirely, if some event takes place, and you underscored this when you mentioned cybercrime, okay, we didn't go into the internet era with a corpus of law and experience telling us how to deal with this. We had to, in a sense, design the airplane, build the airplane, and fly the airplane at the same time. And that's the reality that we deal with here. We try in the report itself to come up with a catalog of potential dangerous scenarios, do some red teaming, and certainly people use their imaginations beyond. They took a step beyond the headlines that we saw, things already, and say, well, this could happen, this could happen. And that has utility, but I don't think anyone can be confident that anyone can anticipate the events. And what was interesting in the dynamics of the discussions we had is that many of the people, again, had backgrounds in law enforcement. Some of them backgrounds in the military, had served abroad in conflict zones, and all had that personal experience of just seeing how fast a country that seems to be normal in every respect can descend into savage levels of violence. Now that can happen in a city, it can happen in a country.
Yeah. All right. Brian, I have a couple related questions. One is, we have approximately 34 days until the election. Is it too late to do anything?
No, it isn't. There are things that are going on. The federal government has put out a great deal of helpful advice on this, and their advice has to be underscored because the federal government doesn't run it; it can advise. And various states have taken measures themselves to address everything from threats to poll workers to specific efforts to educate people about disinformation campaigns and so on. One would like to see, obviously, one would like to see, if we had another couple of years before the election, we could pull together best practices from across the country and put these together in a grand catalog of best practices, which would be very, very helpful. We don't have that. Some states are better prepared than others, but we tried in the report to outline some, as I say, very, very simple things that can be done at the state level, at the local level, to prepare. And in many cases, just being aware is helpful.
Brian, one of the things you mentioned in here that makes so much sense, and I think can be done on very short order, is the preparing for information sharing and analysis. There have been decades of work building upon these law enforcement fusion centers, and I think the states are ready to facilitate that kind of sharing. It just takes a little bit of action and planning. And I would also say that the 18,000 counties and local law enforcement organizations may not know how to plug into their Intel Fusion Center, and now is a good time to be figuring out who to pick up the phone and call if you have an incident.
Look, the concept of information sharing, I think here is absolutely critical, being able to do so very, very rapidly. After 9/11, a superstructure was put into place that would allow communication of threat information from the federal government down to the local. And that has worked reasonably well. It is working better, and again, there's variations across the country, but in terms of information moving from the local up to the federal, but that's still hub and spokes. What you'd like to see is more lateral sharing, a real network that doesn't have to be centrally directed, but just the practice of sharing. One of the things that we had suggested was that for the purposes of dealing with election violence, governors could utilize their fusion centers or in the fusion center concept to put together a purpose-built fusion center that would, in a sense, have the exclusive responsibility of ensuring that all threat information related to the elections was compiled, shared sideways, shared up, and shared down, and so that officials would be better prepared to make decisions.
Thank you, Brian. A question, Luann DeMatti is asking for your context on three things associated with strategic surprise. She says, well, first of all, she thanks you and appreciates this context. And she wanted to get some additional thoughts from you on strategic surprise, given that it's rooted in generally a failure of advanced warning or lack of preparedness or misjudgment. And she's wondering how you would rate the United States stance in each of these three factors. Like, where do we have the most risk is another way she's putting it. Is our biggest risk the fact that we don't have advanced warning? Or is our biggest risk the lack of defense preparedness? Or is our biggest risk misjudgment concerning the threat?
That great question. Look, again, we're those are national security concepts and are highly relevant. However, also keep in mind that at the local level and law enforcement is part of it preventive, but it's primarily reactive. That is, events occur, local law enforcement responds. So therefore, they are always consistently dealing in a reactive mode. In cases where there are potentially large scale events, that is something which requires more intelligence, and there are some real problems in that area. Because when we get into the realm of public disorder intelligence, that is something that is not widely accepted because people say, well, what's the crime? And well, in that, we're not talking about necessarily a crime that has been committed. We're simply talking about the authorities being ready to deal with a large scale event. And that requires, is that event going to have 1,000 people, 10,000 people, 100,000 people? It's going to make a hell of a difference. And some of that's going to come from intelligence. But in terms of surprise, I don't really think in the issue of election violence that somebody gets to claim strategic surprise here. We're not talking about a black swan here. This is a gray rhino. I mean, you can see this one coming at you, and therefore, I think that the weight has to be on the side of preparing, and indeed preparing for, to use the old Roman Latin adage, you hope for the best, you prepare for the worst. And so I think this is a matter of preparation and not a matter of saying, well, let's see if we can, get a long advance warning or something like this. It's a bit of a different atmosphere, but Great question, and I have to ponder that one more.
Okay, great. Well, here's another one, and I know you talked a little bit about this in the report, and would love your context on this. It's Tanya asks about misinformation and disinformation. We all see that this spreads super fast via social media, and was wondering if you have any strategies you would recommend for electoral and government officials to use to mitigate the spread of narratives before they turn into unrest.
There, I think something useful can be done, and going back through my own personal experience in dealing with crisis management situations, whether on behalf of government or on behalf of entities in the private sector, one of the realizations you take away is half of it is what you do, and half of it is how it is perceived. So we're dealing very much with perceptions here. Um, uh, that is very, very much a matter of seizing the initiative in the narrative, being prepared. And as you rightly point out, um, these narratives, erroneous narratives, deliberate misportrayals, can take place at lightning speed. The authorities have to be prepared for that, and be prepared with their own, in a sense, narratives if they're going to try to maintain some degree of some measure of mitigation in these particular cases. And there's some red team thinking helps. It's not that the event that occur is going to precisely fit the scenario for which you're prepared, but having ready prepared answers, having ready prepared responses, public communications responses, I think is critical, and therefore there's sort of another aspect of the report which is not so much in the conclusions that were reached and the writing of the report, but the fact that such a report is written and being circulated. In other words, look, this ought not to be forbidden territory to discuss. We have a democracy. The United States has a long history of violence. We know that. This is a tough country to govern. That's a given. We ought not to be shy about talking about this. This is something which merits open discussion. That's legitimate. It's appropriate. Don't put this one away in the corner and say, whoa, that's just too sensitive to talk about. And so bringing it right out, in the press, in meetings like this one, is a way in which you, in a sense, also are better prepared to combat it.
Thanks, Brian. Thank you for all of this. And we're going to do our part to spread the word and to disseminate your report. We will disseminate links to it, links to the website where you host it on, links to the Amazon book, and we'll share this video too and get it as widely distributed as we can. And with that, can I ask, I'll give you the last word here, Brian, your final parting thoughts on what we should all know about what to do to mitigate election violence?
Well, look, I'm an old guy, but with that comes a degree of optimism. I think the majority of the American people, even when they become passionate about their politics, um, have good common sense, and I think if we pay attention to the problem, uh, keep our heads on in a crisis, we will get through this. We've been through rough patches before in our history, how elections in the 19th century turned into often drunken brawls, and not a few times guns came out. American institutions are resilient. They were built to last. They have lasted longer than any other democracy. And so it's a dark message in the report, but personally, I think we can do this.
Wonderful. That's a great note to end on. So thanks, Brian.
Thank you.